Thanks, Jeffrey, for your question in the chat. I wonder if you want to elaborate at all on what you were, if our responses just avoided the question in your mind, or if you see some interesting ways that we might go with this work of targets and indicators.
No, I appreciate very much. One, I understand the voluntary review is not specifically designed to accomplish what I was describing, but for better or worse, our universities, research-intensive universities, we know how we're measured worldwide in terms of our scholarly impact, however imperfectly. And we've had multiple discussions about whether or not to participate in the Times Higher Ed ranking on impact. My president, was just vehemently opposed to Elsevier and Times Higher Ed and all these others that basically take the information, the product we give them for free, review for them for free, and then charging us for access to it, and or charging us to be coached on how to game the system that they've created. So instead, her focus is very much on she early on launched a population health initiative, which is for healthy people, healthy planet. So it literally is envisioned as university-wide, encompassing all the SDGs. She didn't want to do a separate, seemingly standalone SDG initiative, but she is keen on, if 193 countries have agreed on indicators, that is how you would actually measure whether life is getting better in the communities you serve. There's problems of attribution and all sorts of things, but really focused on that. How do we know whether we're doing better or not? And the world's gotten to know our Institute for Health Metrics in the COVID space maybe better than they knew them for the previous 10 years. But one of the president's mind is that in King County, the county in which the University of Washington in Seattle sits, there is a 17-year differential in life expectancy at birth if you are born in South Seattle versus North Seattle. And whatever we are doing as a university is not adequate to the task if that's the condition. So she's really looking at taking seriously the notion of, we work in partnership with other universities, for-profit firms, nonprofits, governments, and the like. What difference are we making? And the easiest way for me to say, here's how you would measure it, is to say 193 countries agreed on not only these goals and targets, but these very specific metrics. And to your point, Jason, how would you select among them to say, we can't measure everything, but here's some ones we will measure?
Yeah. As you're talking, Jeffrey, what it really makes me think of is in my mind, what the SDGs are most useful for in terms of thinking about impact is that they drive us toward kind of collective impact approaches. And I don't know if you know that particular mechanism of multiple organizations working together, deciding on what is the impact we're trying to achieve, and then having the backbone and the data and whatever to track that progress.
Right.
That's a little bit different than a university saying we're holding ourselves accountable for that differential, because there's so many other actors and there's so much distance between you and the outcomes. But the SDGs, and using the SDG targets and indicators as the basis for those kind of collective action work I think that's one of the biggest values that they bring, is they're outcome and impact oriented, and they drive universities to participating in the work that changes those outcomes.
Right.
Yeah. I really, I didn't mention in the last session, but or maybe I did, that I oversaw New York City's Sustainable Development Goals program, and I came up with this idea of voluntary reporting for the city level. Now, more than 200 cities are doing it, and no one city is doing it the same as the others. We are all using it as a way to talk to each other and learn from each other about programs. But I mentioned, I think in the last session, that there's simply no way that you can have the same sort of data collection for the city of New York as you would for the city of Riverdale, Maryland. But it's a way to talk about these things. And even at the country level, before I did the voluntary local review, we reviewed all of the country level reports, the voluntary national reviews that they're based on. And countries aren't reporting so much on the detailed indicator level. And the fact that let me tell you, I worked at the UN for a long time. 193 countries don't agree on anything. So like the idea that they'd agree on something really specifically concrete and measurable that we should use as a foundation for what how we measure things is, I think, maybe not the way that I see that we should approach this, but rather like, I mean, I think I'll come up, our health professors here, or air quality professors always say the indicator for air quality is whether or not people died from bad air quality, but there's so many measurements in between. People are sick, they have asthma, so on. That's not reflected in the indicators. So I also see this as an opportunity for us as universities who do research to contribute to those conversations. Like, oh, you think this is how you measure air quality? Well, what about these other factors? How can we take those into consideration so we can collectively better understand and measure this impact? And another angle, I think, is that, at CMU, I talked about it in terms of education, research, and practice. So education is our coursework, how we teach things. Research is both things like SciVal and dimensions, but also we're looking at ways to understand other types of research like patents or public speaking engagements. How is that sort of research contributing to the goals? And then practice is things, we divided up practice this year into things like actual university practice, which are human resources policies or, how we have green roofs and so on. And then we have a separate bit that's about how specific CMU community members, professors or students or staff are implementing the SDGs in their own area. And that's more a way to like talk to each other about what we're doing rather than to talk about measuring it. And we're also starting to work with student organizations more to understand what they're interested in, but they've just not been active over the past year because of COVID. But I think, as I mentioned before, this is really just a way to talk about measuring impact, but there's no centralized mechanism or database at any level to do that data comparison.
No, I appreciate both the comments, both Jason's comment. You're absolutely right, focusing on collective action, because we don't do anything in a community that isn't in partnership with all sorts of other players. So this was never about measuring the unique university impact. It was in the communities with which we are engaged. Are things getting better, and how would we know they're getting better, or are they getting worse? And so what's the feedback loop that helps us and our partners make corrective measures? And I'll also say to Alex's comment, this is not about comparing ourselves against every other university in the planet. Sometimes words come out of my president's mouth that make it sound like it's comparative, but no, this isn't about getting a universal set of rankings that's different than Times Higher Ed or something else. This is about how do we hold ourselves as an institution accountable in a world where there is, for all of the challenges about who was and was not represented in those UN conversations, there were 193 countries that signed off on this agenda. So we don't have to create a separate set of indicators. It's just which of those do we use to look at the communities in which we're engaged, and again, to Jason's point, the collective impact.
Mm-hmm.
Jolynn, how did you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, we had a number of discussions about, how if and how we would directly use the targets and indicators, and very much what everyone else is saying, found that very challenging for a university setting, certainly. And, some of the targets are addressed from the STARS data for operations. It's much easier to utilize that framework, those metrics for operations. So, when we utilize STARS, we did have some of the targets that were coming out, that were visible through that process of looking at STARS alongside the SDGs and so forth. Research, definitely some possibilities there. I mean, we've discussed it more concretely in terms of specific things like our SDG 2 hunger initiatives, like we've looked at the targets more closely with Earth University and sort of trying to determine where we might make contributions. So research, I think there's much more of an opportunity there. Service, we looked at teaching as well. I think it would be hard to get to that level for teaching. And it would probably be limiting because you'd miss a lot of valuable teaching by focusing on the targets and indicators for teaching. You'd miss a lot of courses that are doing a really good job of actually, having students critically think about the issues. And then service, I mean, it's incredibly hard to apply any of that to service, and all of these kinds of issues that are very long-term. So, and in the community. So I think it's more important for the universities, it's so context specific, as you said before in the session, I think it's really important for the universities to figure out what makes sense to track, and consider their impact, but to do that in partnership with the partners you're working with. I mean, this is the whole thing, right? With partnerships on in many other countries and locally, that we treat our partners equally. And so doing that in a collaborative way and saying, okay, first we need to make the connections between our projects and what we're investing our time in and the SDGs. And then the second layer is determining how we're going to actually know that we've made an impact through those projects and initiatives. So it's kind of staged in a way. You have to kind of do the big picture first, and then you start to hone down and maybe develop some processes around how can we look at research as it's in development to make that connection to the SDGs, and then to make that connection to how we're measuring it beyond what maybe the academic measurements are. We're measuring it for how do we measure it in terms of the societal benefit at different levels. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a struggle, but I do think that if we fixate too much on the global indicator framework in this work for the universities, we'll be limited. I think it can be very limiting. But I think where it's useful, we should use it. So
yeah, and one thing, this is, I find this in any development work, whether it's in Pittsburgh or, Cambodia, like coming in with an additional set of targets and indicators, especially if you're working directly with the community that's like, we are hungry and our air quality is bad. And you say, well, let me tell you about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is 17 goals. They're like, okay, why are you talking to me about that? I know what my needs are. And so it's sort of the same as I mentioned the last session about talking to your campus community about the goals and what they're already doing. Like, people have been talking about these issues for a long time. This is more like an organizing framework to take everything that people are already talking about and already addressing and see how it works together, and hear how people themselves are measuring what works and doesn't work for them if you're doing community partnerships. But I wanted to also add a point about the research bit and the tagging between SciVal and dimensions and all of those. Like, we use that also for our VUR, but or VUR last year, but we found a lot of inconsistencies, and they're not transparent about their keywords, and we don't know what the process is. So we worked with a student this year who's just my favorite part of all this work is working with the students, we developed a set of keywords based on Elsevier's keywords, based on some other research that we did. We're making that publicly available for a VUR for input from other people who say this works or doesn't work. And he developed an R program through an app that maps text data to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're making that publicly available so people can look at it and refine it, because I think as universities, we can contribute research on how we research the Sustainable Development Goals also. Like, we're not going to profit from this. We want to hear from you about what works, what doesn't, and how we can all collectively sort of do this better. So I wanted to, and that'll be available when we publish our VUR.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for doing that. We did the same thing. We found the SciVal keywords kind of not sufficient at all. We use Cyvel, as I said, but we also developed a keyword list. The only reason it's not in our VUR is because our VUR was already so long. So at the end of the day, we're like, do we want, like, it would have added so many pages to our appendix, but we would be happy to also just have a, sharing of keywords for sure. But thank you for making that publicly available, because I think that's also been our standpoint is we need to be collaborating and we need to be sharing. That's what universities do very well. And so we should use that strength on the SDGs and really make things available so we can all do better together, hopefully. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Jason, you wanted to say something earlier. I think I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll make a very quick point. It's kind of relevant to an earlier comment, and then see if there's anybody else who has questions they'd like to pose. And that was on this question of how do we start to be more intentional about impact in relation to research, and integrate impact considerations earlier on into the development process for research work. We're hoping, fingers crossed, that this works out and we can actually pull something together, but we're hoping to create an offering for researchers that for the moment, we're tagging as impact labs that help them in the development process think about impact way earlier in the process, rather than you formulate your research project and then you think about, okay, now how do I do knowledge mobilization around this thing that I've undertaken and pulled together in my research. So and that in effect, we'd be asking faculty to, and this is kind of language borrowed from the nonprofit world, but to think about their theory of change early on in their process. What are those impacts? And then what are the outputs and activities and assumptions you have to make about how your research is contributing to the impacts that you're hoping to reach? And so we're hoping to pull together some kind of offering for faculty on this, and it's very early days, but that's kind of an in development piece of work that's related to our voluntary review.
And this is exactly why these convenings are so important, is we're also looking at that. And Jason, you and I can't dig into it now, but it's really helpful to know that, so I can talk to you later about it. And I just added in the panel, Jason, Jolyn, and I think we're all part of this UGC Working Group on Voluntary University Reviews, which is established precisely to have conversations like this and to talk about these different questions about indicators. So I put my contact information in there. And Jolyn and Jason, I think you're working on other groups with UGC, and you can add it in the chat. I forget, I'm not sure, but like really, this is such a great opportunity to hear what you're doing and for us to figure out how we might be able to tailor that to our university. And maybe one day, who knows, connect our faculty with yours so they can actually talk to each other using this framework.
Yeah.
Welcome, Hillary. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everybody. My name is Hillary Kahn. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for International Affairs with IUPUI. That's Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis. Nice to be here. Sorry for being so late. I was here early and now I'm back. But very interested in this work. So thank you for facilitating this conversation.
Yeah, can you tell us a little about IUPUI and what you've been doing on the Sustainable Development Goals, or where you are, and if you're considering doing a VUR? Or
yeah, well, we are. I saw UC Davis's VUR last week, and I started salivating and realizing that they were doing such great work. And I was familiar with some of the work actually with Carnegie Mellon as well, and so it's our next step. About 2 years ago, we started committing more fully to the advancement of the SDGs, and we've been working in integrating it across curriculum, particularly into our freshman year seminars, into promoting interdisciplinary global research. We've been partnering with our Office for Research at IUPUI. We're engaging with our Office of Community Engagement, and we are just really trying to sort of understand the landscape at this point. As I think I was saying, I was either last night or earlier to this morning, I'm losing track now of this conference, that we're really in the process of translating all the work at IUPUI into the lexicon of the SDGs, because while our faculty and staff may not recognize it and our students may not recognize it, we're doing a lot to making the world a better place and to advancing this. So we're just been, focusing on spotlights and doing, working across all schools, all 17 schools at IUPUI, but we need to pull it all together, which is why we need a VUR.
Yeah, I mean, that's another one of my favorite bits is like when we were doing the 17 rooms, we had current students, faculty, and staff, 1-hour Zooms, each of the goals, just coming together to talk for an hour about what they were already doing. And people who are working on, clean water and sanitation, who thought they kind of knew everything that was going on in the university, they learned about another part of the university doing something similar, like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that you were doing that. You're part of a different college. Let's work together on that. And how can we more systematically make those links beyond 17 1-hour Zooms? And that's where the VUR for us has been helpful. And like next week, I mentioned we'll be launching ours, which is an interactive online site. And we're making all of that publicly available. But another thing that's really helpful is having, I'm just going to call it what it is, the support group of Jolyn and Jason and other people looking at this to just like talk to each other about the challenges and frustrations and, rewards of doing this, because it is very overwhelming. Like, I think that we've all highlighted that, like, and if you, like Jason keeps mentioning, you have to be intentional from the start, or you can just sort of just go in a million different directions and then suddenly you're left with nothing. So feel free. We all have our contact information. Join the UGC group. Like, we'd be happy to talk in more detail about what you're doing and maybe learn a bit from your experience too. Is there anybody else? There are 9 people I can see that are participating, but we only have 5 people visible. And it would be really great to hear from other. Yes, Alex, tell us about yourself. You can type it in the chat. We saw that you were in the last one. Oh, there you. Yay, fellow Alex. All right.
Hi there.
Hi. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm a professor at University Earth. I teach applied ecology, so I'm given that Earth is more sustainable agriculture. I'm one of the courses that kind of tries to spread across everything and give the students key linkages and relate those back to my personal interests, and a lot of the work we do in the labs and in the field during my class is looking at how different agricultural techniques or treatments affect biodiversity, be it soil organisms or aquatic invertebrates. And so from that, we, pick up the themes of the conversations of sustainable actions and look at unsustainable actions in our surrounding periphery of the campus. Also on the campus, because we're not perfect, right? But, and so it's just kind of, I've been doing a master's in education, and one of the themes that kind of came up in general discussion was, should we do a VUR? Oh, would you like to do that as your thesis? And now I'm like looking at yours and listening and thinking, I would die. But I think it's something that we've just recently done a strategic plan, and we transferred all of our syllabi. We're small, we're undergrad, as many of you know. We do have research, but it's certainly not as big as any of you. But we've just transferred all of our syllabi into skills and attributes. And so it seems like it's a little early to then ask faculty to transfer them all into SDGs. But I think we want to get into this kind of initial, how do we start that process of identifying what all our faculty are involved in, which is going down the route of a VUR, but not just as my thesis, clearly. but no, so I'm really excited to read your reports and see how you guys have done it, because we're at that point of initiating, and we have some sort of faculty surveys already drafted up. But because of COVID, we kind of have stalled on it, because our faculty, as some of you may know, we are more than half time in the field with our students or in the lab. And so COVID modifications have been very challenging. We have a dormitory resident population. And so far we've been very successful so far at keeping COVID off our students. And so we're able to start back in presential, almost face to face with them at a distance, all masked up like crazy people. But we're just beginning to get back into that. And so we're not going to jump in and torture our faculty quite yet. But we're at that process of what are the best tools? Where do we start? And as you say, you know, what are the objectives? Where do we actually want to go with this? How can we be really targeted? Otherwise, we're going to go off down the rabbit warren and never, exactly, it's just going to explode and kill us all.
We just have 2 minutes left, and I see Maria has joined us. I'm lucky enough to know her, but please introduce yourself to everyone else, Maria.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you, Alex, and it's great to be among SDG converts. I am not at all in the academic world, so I'm really enjoying this conversation to learn from you and to see the great work that you're doing. Most of the work that I've done is at the national level and at the city level. So I'm very excited to see empowered academic entities that are really taking innovative approaches to think about how they take ownership of the SDGs. And I'm just curious to see if you've had interactions with either your local authorities or even national authorities and see how you can contribute to the common reporting and common ownership of the SDGs in your area. So that's just, we don't have a lot of time, but I'm just really curious to hear about that and continue listening to the great conversation. Over to you.
Yeah, well, we're going to leave in a few seconds, but here in CMU in Pittsburgh also conducted a voluntary local review. One of our grad students was the lead author on that. We have lots of conversations with the city, and also there's a regional group of non-governmental organizations called Discover that is applying this SDG framework regionally, and we're figuring out what those indicators might look like. So there's more and more local authorities at the local and regional level who are taking this into consideration, and we're talking to them about that. I'm not sure if anyone else has anything to add on that before we get kicked out. Jolynn?
Alex, real quick question. Are you aware of any county reviews, county level instead of just city? I'm just curious.
I've heard rumors that San Diego is looking into it, San Diego County. And also I know that Aaron from LA, the city of LA, has been working at the county level, but I'm not aware of any. There's a state level with Hawaii. And of course, in the US, I think we're all based in the US. The US hasn't yet committed to doing anything concrete on the Sustainable Development Goals, but let's see. But Maria is a bit humble. She's done tons of work for the UN and countries around the world on this, and is really an incredible expert on the goals and a kindred spirit. So thank you for joining, Maria. And Hillary and Alex, please reach out. We're all going through the same thing. Like, just talk to us. It's really helpful. And Jeffrey too, of course. But thanks so much, everyone, for joining. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.